Today's lecture is about the problem of design. So the obvious place to begin, isn't it, is with things that are clearly not designed. This is just a plain ordinary stone. The laws of physics, left on their own, will produce something like that. They can also produce something like this, which looks superficially like a boot, but the resemblance is purely accidental. It means absolutely nothing. Nor does the resemblance of this to a fish mean anything, nor the resemblance of that to a duck's head. This is slightly more interesting, but it's still purely fortuitous. It looks like an egg, and inside is a little dummy embryo. But again, it's pure luck. That's just produced by physics alone. That's also true of these rather beautiful-looking crystals. But this is rather more interesting, because crystals are what you get when atoms, all of the same kind, are allowed to stack up together in the way that they, quote, want to do. It's a different kind of crystal, a desert rose, almost looks as though it might have been made by a jeweler. But all these objects are fortuitous. None of them is designed. All the stones belong in a category that I'm going to call simple. The same is true of clouds and stars. Nobody designed them. They came to be the way they are by the simple consequences of the unaided laws of physics. They're examples of the way things just happen to be. Now we're ready to look at some objects that really are designed. This microscope, nobody could possibly mistake that for an object that just happens to be the way it is. Everything about it, it has design written all over it. It has a long tube to look down, a lens this end, another lens that end, a mirror to reflect light up through the tube, knobs to change the focus, other knobs to move the slide from side to side and back and forth. Even the knobs themselves are roughened to make them easier to grip. A designed object. The same is true of this calculating machine. The same is true of this watch. There are some slightly more difficult cases. These flint arrowheads, there's not much doubt that they're designed. They are shaped in a way that you wouldn't normally expect a stone on the beach to be shaped. This one's a bit more doubtful. Experts tell us, archaeologists tell us, that that is a designed object, that some primitive people did indeed shape that for a purpose, and I'm prepared to believe them. But that's a slightly more difficult case. Never mind about them. There are plenty of objects which are absolutely obviously designed. What do they all have in common, these designed objects? They are all good for some purpose, and they couldn't have come to be the way they are by luck. The microscope is obviously very good at its purpose of greatly magnifying objects, and most certainly it couldn't have come about by luck. If you take a lot of atoms and shake them up at random, then you may get a crystal, but you will not in a billion years get a microscope. This is a gazunder, so-called because it goes under, and it has a more humble purpose than the microscope, but it works very well in its purpose. It's clearly designed. Once we realize what its purpose is, which is to hold water, we can come up with a crude measure of how good it is. We can say the cost of the pot is the amount of clay that goes into it, and the benefit of it is the amount of water that it holds. And so its efficiency is the ratio of the weight of water that it holds to the weight of clay that goes into making it. If we compare it with this pot, which is not made by man, but is a natural stone, it also would hold water, but it wouldn't hold very much water for the amount of stone that goes into it. Its efficiency ratio is not very high, and indeed it's not a designed object. It is a simple object which just happened to be. So we've divided these objects into those that are designed and those that I'm calling simple. But now I want to introduce a large and very important category of objects that are certainly not simple, and I shall argue that they are not designed. But they look overwhelmingly and compellingly as though they were designed. And I'm going to call them designoid objects. Designoid objects look designed, but they actually got their designed look from a very different process, which we'll come on to later. You may find it hard at this stage to believe that designoid objects are not designed, but just wait. So let's have our first designoid object. Thank you. Now this is Andrew, isn't it? And what's the snake called?
Squeeze.
Squeeze. The snake's called Squeeze. It's a boa constrictor, and it is a magnificent example of a designoid object. It looks as though it's been beautifully designed for a purpose, and one of those purposes is swallowing prey which look very much too large for it to swallow. And one of the ways in which it achieves this is by the head. All right. The bones of the head, the bones of the skull, are capable of detaching, coming apart, under the skin, of course, so that the head swells to a huge size relative to what it starts. And there's a great gaping maw, which is capable then of swallowing very much larger prey than you'd think. The skin here is a beautiful mottled colour, which you could imagine would be very, very highly camouflaged in a forest. The snake has lost its legs. Losing legs is a very common thing among reptiles. There are many lines of evolution of reptiles which have lost their legs. What the boa constrictor is best at is throttling its prey. And I think that both Andrew and Squeeze deserve a round of applause. Thank you very much. Just looking at the outside of Squeeze gives us no real idea at all of what an extraordinarily complicated structure he and all other living things is. A living thing like Squeeze is not just more complicated than the microscope. It is billions of times more complicated than the microscope. Let's come back to pots. We've seen a designed pot, and we've seen a simple accidental pot. Now, here's a designoid pot. This is a pitcher plant. Here you see the individual pitchers. There's an enlargement. They're filled with water, and they're traps for insects. Insects fall into the trap and drown. This is how a pitcher begins. This is the next stage in development. It begins as a leaf. You see the hole just beginning to form. This is a young pitcher. And then we're going to see, there's the full pitcher, there's a fly climbing up it, there's a slippery area at the top, the fly's down into the water, it's now going to drown, and in due course, its products will be digested by the plant. Here is a live pitcher plant, here is one of its pitchers, you can see the little lid over it, there's the slip zone there, and inside is the water. It appears to be a well-designed object, a well-designed pot. If we were to do our cost-benefit ratio, our measure of the amount of water that it holds over the weight of the plant material itself, we'd find that it was a very efficient pot indeed. But we'd also find that if we looked inside, cut sections of it, it would have a very complicated structure. This is the inside of a single cell of a pitcher plant through an electron microscope. And you can see the complexity of it. What's more interesting is that this internal structure is very well fitted to make a lot of oxygen and secrete it into the water of the pitcher. And this has a very useful effect, because in the water of the pitcher are living a motley crew of little maggots and other insects. Now, what are they doing? Well, it's all very well eating insects, like a pitcher plant does, but a plant doesn't have any teeth, and it's difficult to eat insects if you haven't got teeth. So what the pitcher plant in effect does is to borrow the teeth of these maggots in its pitcher. What the maggots do is they eat the prey that fall into the pitcher, and then their excretory products are what are finally absorbed by the pitcher plant. So really the pitcher plant is just getting the same thing as any other plant gets when it eats manure, in effect. But what the pitcher plant is doing is sequestering for itself a private supply of manure by luring insects and by supplying the maggots that live in the pot with a nice oxygen-rich freshwater atmosphere which otherwise they wouldn't like to live in. Here's another sort of pot, a designoid pot. This is made by a trapdoor spider. You can see the trapdoor at the top. The spider lives inside. And another one here. This is the pot of a potter wasp. That's a solitary wasp, not like the social wasps which build comb more like this honeycomb here. The potter wasp female builds a pot like that out of mud and lays her egg in it, and then the larva grows up inside the pot. Look how beautifully it resembles this designed pot. This is a truly designed pot made by somebody in Mexico. See how similar it is to the pot made by the potter wasp. Yet another animal pot. This was made by a mason bee. Exquisite little thing. It is used for the same purpose as the potter wasp's pot, but it has a different structure. It is just like a house built by humans. These are little individual stones which the bee, the female bee, has gathered and has cemented together to build up this delightful pot structure. And the story doesn't end there, because we can only see one pot, but underneath here are 4 more pots. And they've been carefully covered up by the bee, who has gone to the river and gathered clay to cover over her pots. The clay is exactly the same colour and texture as the rock on which the pot is placed, so that the bee's predators, the predators who might come and eat larvae out of the pot, would never known a million years that there were any pots under there. Here's another beautiful example of designoid architecture. These gigantic megaliths, like Avebury or Stonehenge, are built by the Compass termite of Australia. They're huge structures, like blocks of flats. Certainly on termite scale, they are like blocks of flats. They are all pointing exactly north-south, which is another very cunning feature, because that means that they get the morning sun on one side and they get the evening sun on the other, so they get nicely warmed up in the cool parts of the day. But in the hot part of the day, the midday sun, that hits them end on, and so they don't heat up too much, which is why all these termite nests, they're called compass termites. You can always, when you're in the desert, tell which direction north-south is by looking for a compass termite nest. Even larger is this another kind of termite nest. You can see the scale there. This is a most colossal structure. The Austrian ethologist Karl von Frisch remarked that if humans built structures on the same scale as termites do, then the structures that we would build would be 4 times as high as the Empire State Building. So termites are very, very impressive architects. These designoid objects are very impressive indeed. We're switching now from objects which are apparently designed by animals to the design of animals themselves, the apparent design of animals themselves. And I'm beginning with camouflage. If you were walking through the desert, you would probably think, to a casual look, that that was a stone. But it's not a stone, it's a grasshopper. It just looks like a stone, and it gets protection from looking like a stone. And in the next example, this looks to me exactly like seaweed. It's one of my favourite of all designoid objects. It is in fact a fish. It's a seahorse. There's its head, there's its neck, there's its body. And these objects sticking out here are part of the fish's body, but anybody would think that they were parts of a seaweed. They look exactly like parts of a seaweed, and the seahorse hides among seaweed of just the right type. It's almost perfectly camouflaged. And we have a few more examples. This is a film of, and you'll see what it is in a moment, it's in fact a leaf insect. There's the shield over the thorax, there's the head, here come the wings, and when it isn't moving, perhaps even when it is moving, it looks exactly like leaves. It's just flown off. Here's another thing, looks just like a plant, turns out to be a green snake. And this, you would think, was a plant with a bud on the end, a long green stem, more buds. Only when we get to the front end do we just about spot that it has an eye, antennae, and legs. It is, in fact, a stick insect. Look at these leaves here. Autumn leaves. Look at the vein up the middle of the leaves. Look at the veins on either side. Look at the little splodges of dark-coloured mould on the leaves. But those are not leaves. Those are butterflies. Look there, you can just see the body there, 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 there. That's what these butterflies look like when they open their wings. This is what they look like on the underside of the wings. And they normally sit with the wings folded so that you only see the underside of the wings. And you're very hard put to it to see that they're not dead leaves. Only when they open the wings do you get this flash of brilliant coloration. Camouflaged animals resemble inedible objects. Designoid objects sometimes resemble other designoid objects for other reasons, because they're doing the same job. And this is called convergent evolution. This is an ordinary hedgehog. That is nothing whatever to do with a hedgehog, but superficially it looks like it. That is a spiny anteater. It is a mammal, but you might say only just a mammal. It's an egg-laying mammal, a very primitive mammal from Australia and New Guinea. As a matter of fact, its way of life is not that close to a hedgehog's way of life. This is an anteater, whereas hedgehogs eat more general things, insects and worms and things. But both of them gain protection from having spiny skins, and so they both superficially look very alike. An example of convergent evolution. An even better example of convergent evolution is the so-called marsupial wolf.